Chapter 7. 40 years ago, in the Southern States, superstition held an exalted place with all classes, but more especially with the blacks and uneducated or poor whites. This was shown more clearly in their belief in witchcraft in general, and the devil in particular. To both of these classes the devil was a real being, sporting a clubfoot, horns, tail, and a hump on his back. The influence of the devil was far greater than that of the Lord. If one of these votaries had stolen a pig, and the fear of the Lord came over him, he would most likely ask the Lord to forgive him, but still cling to the pig. But if the fear of the devil came upon him, in all probability he would drop the pig and take to his heels. In those days the city of St. Louis had a large number who had implicit faith in voodooism. I once attended one of their midnight meetings. In the pale rays of the moon, the dark outlines of a large assemblage was visible, gathered about a small fire, conversing in different tongues. They were Negroes of all ages, women, children, and men. Finally the noise was hushed, and the assembled group assumed an attitude of respect. They made way for their queen, and a short black old negress came upon the scene, followed by two assistants, one of whom bore a cauldron and the other a box. The cauldron was placed over the dying embers. The queen drew forth, from the folds of her gown, a magic wand, and the crowd formed a ring around her. Her first act was to throw some substance on the fire. The flames shot up with a lurid glare. Now it writhed in serpent coils, now it darted upward in forked tongues, and then it gradually transformed itself into a veil of dusky vapors. At this stage, after a certain amount of gibberish and wild gesticulation from the queen, the box was opened, and frogs, lizards, snakes, dog liver, and beef hearts drawn forth and thrown into the cauldron. Then followed more gibberish and gesticulation, when the congregation joined hands and began the wildest dance imaginable, keeping it up until the men and women sank to the ground from mere exhaustion. In the ignorant days of slavery there was a general belief that a horseshoe hung over the door would ensure good luck. I have seen Negroes otherwise comparatively intelligent refuse to pick up a pen, needle, or other such object dropped by a Negro, because, as they alleged, if the person who dropped the articles had a spite against them, to touch anything they dropped would voodoo them and make them seriously ill. Nearly every large plantation with any considerable number of Negroes had at least one who laid claim to be a fortune teller, and who was regarded with more than common respect by his fellow slaves. Dinky, a full-blooded African, large in frame, coarse-featured, and claiming to be a descendant of a king in his native land, was the oracle on the Poplar farm. At the time of which I write, Dinky was about 50 years of age, and had lost an eye, and was, to say the least, a very ugly-looking man. No one in that section was considered so deeply immersed in voodooism, gooferism, and fortune-telling as he. Although he had been many years in the Gaines family, no one could remember the time when Dinky was called upon to perform manual labor. He was not sick, yet he never worked. No one interfered with him. If he felt like feeding the chickens, pigs, or cattle, he did so. Dinky hunted, slept, was at the table at meal time, roamed through the woods, went to the city, and returned when he pleased, with no one to object or to ask a question. Everybody treated him with respect. The whites, throughout the neighborhood, tipped their hats to the old one-eyed Negro, while the policemen or patrollers permitted him to pass without a challenge. The Negroes everywhere stood in mortal fear of Uncle Dinky. The blacks who saw him every day were always thrown upon their good behavior, when in his presence. I once asked a Negro why they appeared to be afraid of Dinky. He looked at me, shrugged his shoulders, smiled, shook his head, and said, "I ain't afraid of the devil, but I ain't ready to go to him just yet." He then took a look around and behind, as if he feared someone would hear what he was saying, and then continued, "Dinky's got the power, sir. He knows things seen and unseen, and that's what makes him his own massa." It was literally true. This man was his own master. He wore a snake skin around his neck, carried a petrified frog in one pocket, and a dried lizard in the other. A slave speculator once came along and offered to purchase Dinky. Dr. Gaines, no doubt, thought it a good opportunity to get the elephant off his hands, and accepted the money. A day later the trader returned the old Negro with a threat of a suit at law for damages. A new overseer was employed by Dr. Gaines to take charge of Poplar Farm. His name was Grove Cook, and he was widely known as a man of ability in managing plantations and in raising a large quantity of produce from a given number of hands. Cook was called a hard overseer. The Negroes dreaded his coming, and for weeks before his arrival the overseer's name was on every slave's tongue. Cook came. He called the Negroes up, men and women, counted them, looked them over as a purchaser would a drove of cattle that he intended to buy. As he was about to dismiss them, he saw Dinky come out of his cabin. The sharp eye of the overseer was at once on him. "Who is that nigger?" inquired Cook. "That is Dinky," replied Dr. Gaines. "What is his place?" continued the overseer. "Oh, Dinky is a gentleman at large," was the response. "Have you any objection to his working?" "None whatever." "Well, sir," said Cook, "I'll put him to work to morrow morning." Dinky was called up and counted in. At the roll call, the following morning, all answered except the conjurer. He was not there. The overseer inquired for Dinky and was informed that he was still asleep. "I will bring him out of his bed in a hurry," said Cook, as he started towards the Negro's cabin. Dinky appeared at his door just as the overseer was approaching. "Follow me to the barn," said the impatient driver to the Negro. "I make it a point always to whip a nigger the first day that I take charge of a farm, so as to let the hands know who I am. And now, Mr. Dinky, they tell me that you have not had your back tanned for many years, and that being the case I shall give you a flogging that you will never forget. Follow me to the barn." Cook started for the barn, but turned and went into his house to get his whip. At this juncture Dinky gave a knowing look to the other slaves, who were standing by, and said, "If he lays the weight of his finger on me, you'll see the top of that barn come off." The reappearance of the overseer with the large Negro whip in one hand and a club in the other, with the significant demand of "Follow me," caused a deep feeling in the breast of every Negro present. Dr. Gaines, expecting a difficulty between his new driver and the conjurer, had arisen early and was standing at his bedroom window looking on. The news that Dinky was to be whipped spread far and near over the place, and had called forth men, women, and children. Even Uncle Ned, the old Negro of 90 years, had crawled out of his straw and was at his cabin door. As the barn doors closed behind the overseer and Dinky, a death-like silence pervaded the entire group, who, instead of going to their labor, as ordered by the driver, was standing as if paralyzed, gazing intently at the barn, expecting every moment to see the roof lifted. Not a word was spoken by anyone except Uncle Ned, who smiled, shook his head, put on a knowing countenance, and said, "My word for it, the overseer ain't a-goin' to whip Dinky." 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes passed, and the usual sound of "Oh, pray, massa! Oh, pray, massa!" heard on the occasion of a slave being punished, had not yet proceeded from the barn. Many of the older Negroes gathered around Uncle Ned, for he and Dinky occupied the same cabin, and the old superannuated slave knew more about the affairs of the conjurer than any one else. Ned told of how on the previous night Dinky had slept but little, had closely inspected the snakeskin around his neck, the petrified frog and dried lizard in his pockets, and had rubbed himself all over with goopher. And when he had finished, he knelt and exclaimed, "Now, good and lovely devil, for more than 20 years I have served you faithfully. Before I got into your service, the white folks bought and sold me and my old wife and chillen, and whipped me and half starved me. Dey did treat me mighty bad, dat you knows. Den I used to pray to the Lord, but dat did no good, 'cause the white folks don't fear the Lord. But they fears you, and ever since I got into your service, I is able to do as I please. No white dares to lay his hand on me, and this is all owing to the power that you give me. Oh, good and lovely devil, please to continue that power. A new overseer is to come here tomorrow, and he wants to get me in his hands. But, dear devil, I ask you to stand by me in this my trial hour, and I will never desert you as long as I live. Continue this power. Make me strong in your cause. Make me to be more faithful to you, and let me still be able to conquer my enemies, and I will give you all the glory and will try to deserve a seat at your right hand." With bated breath, everyone listened to Uncle Ned. All had the utmost confidence in Dinky's power. None believed that he would be punished, while a large number expected to see the roof of the barn burst off at any moment. At last the suspense was broken. The barn door flew open. The overseer and the conjurer came out together, walking side by side, and separated when halfway up the walk. As they parted, Cook went to the field, and Dinky to his cabin. The slaves all shook their heads significantly. The fact that the old Negro had received no punishment was evidence of his victory over the slave driver. But how the feat had been accomplished was a mystery. No one dared to ask Dinky, for he was always silent, except when he had something to communicate. Everyone was afraid to inquire of the overseer. There was, however, one faint chance of getting an inkling of what had occurred in the barn, and that was through Uncle Ned. This fact made the old superannuated slave the hero and center of attraction for several days. Many were the applications made to Ned for information, but the old man did not know or wish to exaggerate the importance of what he had learned. "I tell you," said Dolly, "Dinky is a power." "He's nobody's fool," responded Hannah. "I would not make him mad with me for this whole world," ejaculated Jim. Just then Nancy, the cook, came in brimful of news. She had given Uncle Ned some crackling bread, which had pleased the old man so much that he had opened his bosom and told her all that he got from Dinky. This piece of information flew quickly from cabin to cabin and brought the slaves hastily into the kitchen. It was night. Nancy sat down, looked around, and told Billy to shut the door. This heightened the interest, so that the fall of a pin could have been heard. All eyes were upon Nancy, and she felt keenly the importance of her position. Her voice was generally loud, with a sharp ring which could be heard for a long distance, especially in the stillness of the night. But now Nancy spoke in a whisper, occasionally putting her finger to her mouth, indicating a desire for silence, even when the breathing of those present could be distinctly heard. "When dey got in the barn, the overseer said to Dinky, 'Strip yourself. I don't want to tear your clothes with my whip. I'm going to tear your black skin.' Den, you see, Dinky told the overseer to look in the east corner of the barn. He looked, and he saw hell, with all the torments, and the devil with his cloven foot strutting about there just as if he was cock of the walk. And Dinky told Cook that if he lay his finger on him, he'd call the devil up to take him away." "And what did Cook say to that?" asked Jim. "Let me 'lone. I didn't tell you all," said Nancy. "Den, you see, the overseer turned pale in the face, and he say to Dinky, 'Let me go this time, and I'll never trouble you any more.'" This concluded Nancy's story, as related to her by old Ned, and religiously believed by all present. Whatever caused the overseer to change his mind regard to the flogging of Dinky, it was certain that he was most thoroughly satisfied to let the old negro off without the threatened punishment, and although he remained at Poplar Farm as overseer for 5 years, he never interfered with the conjurer again. It is not strange that ignorant people should believe in characters of Dinky's stamp. But it is really marvelous that well-educated men and women should give any countenance whatever to such delusions as were practiced by the oracle of Poplar Farm. The following illustration may be taken as a fair sample of the easy manner in which Dinky carried on his trade. Miss Martha Lemmy, being on a visit to Mrs. Gaines, took occasion during the day to call upon Dinky. The conjurer knew the antecedents of his visitor, and was ready to give complete satisfaction in his particular line. When the young lady entered the old man's cabin, he met her, bade her be welcome, and tell what she had come for. She took a seat on one stool, and he on another. Taking the lady's right hand in his, Dinky spit into its palm, rubbed it, looked at it, shut his one eye, opened it, and said, "I sees a young gentleman, and he's rich, and owns plenty of land and a heap of niggers, and lo, Miss Martha, he loves you." The lady drew a long breath of seeming satisfaction, and asked, "Are you sure that he loves me, Uncle Dinky?" "Oh, Miss Martha, I knows it like a book." "Have you ever seen the gentleman?" the lady inquired. The conjurer began rubbing the palm of the snow-white hand, talked to himself in an undertone, smiled, then laughed out, and saying, "Why, Miss Martha, as I lives, it's Mr. Scott, and he's thinking about you now. Yes, he's got his mind on you this bressed minute. But how he's changed since I seed him the last time. Now he's got side whiskers and a mustache on his chin. But let me see. Here's something strange. The web looks a little smoky, and when I gets to that spot, I can't get along till a little silver is given to me." Here the lady drew forth her purse and gave the old man a $half-dollar piece that made his one eye fairly twinkle. He resumed, "Ah, now the fog is cleared away, and I see that Mr. Scott is sitting in a rocking chair with both feet on the table and smoking a cigar." "Do you think Mr. Scott loves me?" inquired the lady. "Oh, yes," responded Dinky. "He just sets his whole heart on you. Indeed, Miss Martha, he's almost dying about you." "He never told me that he loved me," remarked the lady. "But then, you see, he's backward. He ain't got his eye teeth cut yet in love matters. But he'll get a little bolder every time he sees you," replied the negro. "Do you think he'll ever ask me to marry him?" "Oh, yes, Miss Martha, he's sure to do that. As he sets there in his rocking chair, he looks mighty solemn-cally. Looks like he wanted to ask you to have him now." "Do you think that Mr. Scott likes any other lady, Uncle Dinky?" asked Miss Lemmy. "Well, Miss Martha, I'll just consult the web and see." And here the conjurer shut his one eye, opened it, shut it again, talked to himself in an undertone, opened his eye, looked into the lady's hand, and exclaimed, "Ah, Miss Martha, I see a lady in the way, and she's got riches. But the web is smoky, and it needs a little silver to clear it up." With tears in her eyes, and almost breathless, Miss Lemmy hastily took from her pocket her purse, and handed the old man another piece of money, saying, "Please go on." Dinky smiled, shook his head, got up and shut his cabin door, sat down, and again took the lady's hand in his. "Yes, I see," said he, "I see it's a lady, but bless your soul, Miss Martha, it's a likeness of you that Mr. Scott is looking at. That's all." This morsel of news gave great relief, and Miss Lemmy dried her eyes with joy. Dinky then took down the old rusty horseshoe from over his cabin door, held it up, and said, "Dis horseshoe nefer lies." Here he took out of his pocket a bag made of the skin of the rattlesnake, and took from it some goopher, sprinkled it over the horseshoe, saying, "Dis is de stuff, Miss Martha, dat's gwine to make you Mr. Scott's conqueror. Long as you keep dis goopher 'bout you, he can't git away from you. He'll ax you for a kiss de bery next time he meets you, and he can't help himself from doing it. No woman can git him from you so long as you keep dis goopher 'bout you." Here Dinky lighted a tallow candle, looked at it, smiled, shook his head. "You's gwine to marry Mr. Scott in 'bout 1 year, and you's gwine to have 13 children, 7 boys and 6 gals, and you's gwine to have a heap of riches." Just then Dinky's interesting revelations were cut short by Ike and Cato bringing along Peter, who, it was said, had been killed by the old Bell sheep. It appears that Peter had a way of playing with the old ram, who was always ready to butt at anyone who got in his way. When seeing the ram coming, Peter would get down on his hands and knees and pretend that he was going to have a butting match with the sheep, and when the latter would come full tilt at him, Peter would dodge his head so as to miss the ram, and the latter would jump over the boy, turn around angrily, shake his head, and start for another butt at Peter. This kind of play was repeated sometimes for an hour or more, to the great amusement of both whites and blacks. But on this occasion Peter was completely caught. As he was on his hands and knees, the ram started on his usual run for the boy. The latter, in dodging his head, run his face against a stout stub of dry rye stalk, which caused him to quickly jerk up his head, just in time for the sheep to give him a fair butt squarely in the forehead, which knocked Peter senseless. The ram, elated with his victory, began to back himself for another lick at Peter, when the men, seeing what had happened to the poor boy, took him up and brought him to Dinky's cabin to be resuscitated, or brought to, as they termed it. Nearly an hour passed in rubbing the boy before he began to show signs of consciousness. He come to, but he never again accepted a butting match with the ram. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Cruelty to Negroes was not practiced in our section. It is true there were some exceptional cases, and some individuals did not take the care of their servants at all times that economy seemed to demand. Yet a certain degree of punishment was actually needed to ensure respect to the master, and good government to the slave population. If a servant disobeyed orders, it was necessary that he should be flogged, to deter others from following the bad example. If a servant ran away, he must be caught and brought back to let others see that the same fate awaited them if they made similar attempts. While the keeping of bloodhounds for running down and catching Negroes was not common, yet a few were kept by Mr. Tabor, an inferior white man, near the corners, who hired them out or hunted the runaway, charging so much per day, or a round sum for the catch. Jerome, a slave owned by the Reverend Mr. Wilson, when about to be punished by his master, ran away. Tabor and his dogs were sent for. The slave catcher came, and at once set his dogs upon the trail. The parson and some of the neighbors went along for the fun that was in store. These dogs will attack a Negro at their master's bidding, and cling to him as a bulldog will cling to a beast. Many are the speculations as to whether the Negro will be secured alive or dead when these dogs get on his track. However, on this occasion there was not much danger of ill treatment, for Mr. Wilson was a clergyman, and was of a humane turn, and bargained with Tabor not to injure the slave if he could help it. The hunters had been in the wood a short time, ere they got on the track of 2 slaves, one of whom was Jerome. The Negroes immediately bent their steps toward the swamp, with the hope that the dogs would, when put upon the scent, be unable to follow them through the water. Nearer and nearer the whimpering pack pressed on, their delusion began to dispel. All at once the truth flashed upon the minds of the fugitives, like a glare of light, that it was Tabor with his dogs. They at last reached the river, and in the negroes plunged, followed by the catch dog. Jerome was finally caught, and once more in the hands of his master, while the other man found a watery grave. They returned, and the preacher sent his slave to the city jail for safekeeping. While the planters would employ Tabor without hesitation to hunt down their negroes, they would not receive him into their houses as a visitor any sooner than they would one of their own slaves. Tabor was, however, considered one of the better class of poor whites, a number of whom had a religious society in that neighborhood. The pastor of the poor whites was the Reverend Martin Louder, somewhat of a genius in his own way. The following sermon, preached by him about the time of which I write, will well illustrate the character of the people for whom he labored. More than 2 long weary hours had now elapsed since the audience had been convened, and the people began to exhibit slight signs of fatigue. Some few scrapings and rasping of cowhide boots on the floor, an audible yawn or two, a little twisting and turning on the narrow, uncomfortable seats, while in 1 or 2 instances a somnolent soul or two snored outright. These palpable signs were not lost upon our old friend Louder. He cast an eye, emphatically an eye, over the assemblage, and then he spoke. "My dear brethren and beloved sistren, you've been a long time a-sitting on your seats. You're tired, I know, and I don't expect you want to hear the old daddy preach. If you don't want to hear the old man, just give him the least bit of a sign. Cough, hold up your hand, anything, and Louder'll sit right down. He'll dry up in a minute." At this juncture of affairs, Louder paused for a reply. He glanced furtively over the audience in search of the individual who might be tired of settin' on his seat. But no sign was made. No such malcontent came within the visual range. "Go on, Brother Louder," said a sonorous voice in the Amen corner of the house. Thus encouraged, the speaker proceeded in his remarks. "Well, then, brethren, since you say so, Louder'll proceed, but he don't intend to preach a regular sermon, for it's a-getting late, and our sect which it don't believe in eating cold vittles on the Lord's day. My brethren, if the old Louder gets out on the right track, I want you to call him back. He don't want to teach you any error. He don't want to preach nothing but what's found between the leads of this blessed book. My dear brethren, the Lord raised up his servant Moses that he should fetch his people Israel up out in that wicked land. Then Moses, he went out from the face of the Lord, and departed hence unto the courts of the old tyrannical king. And what says you, Moses? Ah, says he, Moses says he to that wicked old Pharaoh, thus says the Lord God of hosts, says he, let my Israel go. And what says the old hard-hearted king? Ah, says Pharaoh, says he, who is the Lord God of hosts, says he, that I should obey his voice? And now, what says you, Moses? Ah, Moses says he, thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they might worship me, says the Lord, in the wilderness. But, my beloved brethren and my hardened, impenitent friends, did the old hard-hearted king hearken to the words of Moses and let my people go? Nary time. This last remark, made in an ordinary conversational tone of voice, was so sudden and unexpected that the change, the transition from the singing state, was electrical. Ah, then, my beloved brethren and sistren, what next? What says you, Moses, to Pharaoh, that contrary old king? Ah, Moses says to Pharaoh, says he, Moses says he, thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, says the Lord, lest I come, says he, and smite you with a cuss. And what says Pharaoh, the old tyrannical king? Ah, says he, says old Pharaoh, let their tasks be doubled, and lest they might grumble, says he, those bricks shall be made without straw. Voz natural. Made 'em pluck up grass and stumble out in the fields, brethren, to mix with the mud. Mighty hard on the poor critters, wasn't it, Brother Floodgate? The individual thus interrogated replied, just so, and old Louder moved along. And what next? Did the old king let my people Israel go? No, my dear brethren, he retched out his pizen hand, and he hilt them fash. Then the Lord was wroth with that wicked old king. And the Lord, he said to Moses, says he, Moses, stretch forth now thy rod over the rivers and the ponds of this wicked land. And behold, says he, when thou stretch out thy rod, says the Lord, all the waters shall be turned into blood. Then Moses, he took his rod, and he done as the Lord God of Israel had commanded his servant Moses to do. And what then, say you, my brethren? Why, lo and behold, the rivers of that wicked land was all turned into blood, and all the fish and all the frogs in them streams and waters died. Yes, said the speaker, lowering his voice to a natural tone, and glancing out of the open window at the dry and dusty road, for we were at the time suffering from a protracted drought. And I believe the frogs will all die now, unless we get some rain pretty soon. What do you think about it, Brother Waters? This interrogatory was addressed to a fine, portly-looking old man in the congregation. Brother W. nodded assent, and old Louder resumed the thread of his discourse. Ah, my beloved brethren, that was a hard time on old Pharaoh and his wicked crowd, for the waters was loathsome to the people, and it smelt so bad none of 'em could drink it. And what next? Did the old king obey the voice of the Lord and let my people Israel go? Oh, no, my brethren, not by a long sight, for he hilt out again the Lord and obeyed not his voice. Then the Lord sent a gang of bullfrogs into that wicked land, and they went hopping and lopping about all over the country and to the victuals and everywhere else. My brethren, the old Louder thinks that was a desperate time, but all wouldn't do. Old Pharaoh was as stubborn as one of Louder's mules, and he wouldn't let the chosen seed go up out in the land of bondage. Then the Lord sent a mighty hail, and out of that his devouring locusts, and they ate up blame nigh everything on the face of the earth. Let not your hearts be troubled, for the truth is mighty and must prevail. Brother Creek, you don't seem to be doing much of anything. Suppose you raise a tune. This remark was addressed to a tall, lank, hollow-jawed old man in the congregation, with a great shock of grizzled gray hair. Wait a minute, Brother Louder, till I get on my glasses, was the reply of Brother Creek, who proceeded to draw from his pocket an oblong tin case, which opened and shut with a tremendous snap, from which he drew a pair of iron-rimmed spectacles. These he carefully dusted with his handkerchief, and then turned to the hymn which the preacher had selected, and read out to the congregation. After considerable deliberation and some clearing of the throat, hawking, spitting, etc., and other preliminaries, Brother Creek, in a quivering, split sort of voice, opened out on the tune. Louder seemed uneasy. It was evident that he feared a failure on the part of the worthy brother. At the end of the first line he exclaimed, "'Pears to me, Brother Creek, you hain't got the right miter. Brother Creek suspended operations a moment and replied, "I am purty correct, generally, Brother Louder, and I'm confident she'll come out all right." "Well," said Louder, "we'll try her again." And the choral strain, under the supervision of Brother Creek, was resumed in the following words: "When I was a mourner just like you, washed in the blood of the Lamb, I fasted and prayed till I got through, washed in the blood of the Lamb." Chorus. "Come along, sinner, and go with us. If you don't, you will be cussed. Religion's like a blooming rose, washed in the blood of the Lamb, as none but those that feel it knows, washed in the blood of the Lamb." The singing, joined in by all present, brought the enthusiasm of the assembly up to white heat, and the shouting, with the loud Amen, God save the sinner, sing it, brother, sing it, made the welkin ring. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. While the peculiar institution was a great injury to both master and slaves, yet there was considerable truth in the oft-repeated saying that the slave was happy. It was indeed a low kind of happiness, existing only where masters were disposed to treat their servants kindly, and where the proverbial light-heartedness of the latter prevailed. History shows that of all races the African was best adapted to be the hewers of wood and drawers of water. Sympathetic in his nature, thoughtless in his feelings, both alimentiveness and amativeness large, the Negro is better adapted to follow than to lead. His wants easily supplied, generous to a fault, large fund of humor, brimful of music, he has ever been found the best and most accommodating of servants. The slave would often get rid of punishment by his wit, and even when being flogged, the master's heart has been moved to pity by the humorous appeals of his victim. House servants in the cities and villages, and even on plantations, were considered privileged classes. Nevertheless, the field hands were not without their happy hours. An old-fashioned corn shucking took place once a year on Poplar Farm, which afforded pleasant amusement for the outdoor Negroes for miles around. On these occasions, the servants on all plantations were allowed to attend by mere invitation of the blacks where the corn was to be shucked. As the grain was brought in from the field, it was left in a pile near the corn cribs. The night appointed, and invitations sent out, slaves from plantations 5 or 6 miles away would assemble and join on the road, and in large bodies march along, singing their melodious plantation songs. To hear 3 or 4 of these gangs coming from different directions, their leaders giving out the words and the whole company joining in the chorus, would indeed surpass anything ever produced by Haverly's minstrels, and many of their jokes and witticisms were never equaled by Sam Lucas or Billy Kerson's. A supper was always supplied by the planter on whose farm the shucking was to take place. Often, when approaching the place, the singers would speculate on what they were going to have for supper. The following song was frequently sung: "All dem pretty gals will be there, shuck dat corn before you eat. They will fix it for us rare, shuck dat corn before you eat. I know dat supper will be big, shuck dat corn before you eat. I think I smell a fine roast pig, shuck dat corn before you eat. A supper is provided, so they said, shuck dat corn before you eat. I hope dey'll have some nice wheat bread, shuck dat corn before you eat. I hope dey'll have some coffee there, shuck dat corn before you eat. I hope dey'll have some whiskey there, shuck dat corn before you eat. I think I'll fill my pockets full, shuck dat corn before you eat. Stuff dat coon and bake him down, shuck dat corn before you eat. I spec some niggers there from town, shuck dat corn before you eat. Please cook dat turkey nice and brown. Shuck dat corn before you eat. By the side of dat turkey I'll be found. Shuck dat corn before you eat. I smell the supper, dat I do. Shuck dat corn before you eat. On the table will be a stew. Shuck dat corn, etc. Burning pine knots, held by some of the boys, usually furnished light for the occasion. 2 hours is generally sufficient time to finish up a large shucking, where 500 bushels of corn is thrown into the cribs as the shuck is taken off. The work is made comparatively light by the singing, which never ceases till they go to the supper table. Something like the following is sung during the evening: "De possum meat him good to eat. Carve him to the heart. You'll always find him good and sweet. Carve him to the heart. My dog did bark, and I went to see. Carve him to the heart. And there was a possum up that tree. Carve him to the heart." Chorus: "Carve dat possum, children. Carve dat possum, carve him to the heart. Oh, carve dat possum, children. Carve dat possum, carve him to the heart. I reached up for to pull him in. Carve him to the heart. The possum he began to grin. Carve him to the heart. I carried him home and dressed him off. Carve him to the heart. I hung him that night in the frost. Carve him to the heart." Chorus: "Carve dat possum, etc. The way to cook the possum sound. Carve him to the heart. First parboil him, then bake him brown. Carve him to the heart. Lay sweet potatoes in the pan. Carve him to the heart. The sweetest eatin' in the land. Carve him to the heart." Chorus: "Carve dat possum, etc." Should a poor supper be furnished, on such an occasion, you would hear remarks from all parts of the table: "Take dat roast pig 'way from dis table." "What roast pig? You see any roast pig here?" "Ha, ha, ha! Dis ain't the place to see roast pig. Pass up some dat turkey wid clam sauce." "Don't talk about dat turkey. He was gone afore we come. Dis is the last time I shucks corn at dis farm. Dis is a cheap farm, cheap owner, and a cheap supper." "He's talking it, ain't he? Dis is de toughest meat that I has been called upon to eat for many a day. You's got to have teeth sharp as a saw to eat dis meat. S'pose you ain't got no teeth, den what you gwine do?" "Why, if you ain't got no teeth, you must gum it." "Ha, ha, ha!" from the whole company was heard. On leaving the corn shucking farm, each gang of men, headed by their leader, would sing during the entire journey home. Some few, however, having their dogs with them, would start on the trail of a coon, possum, or some other game, which might keep them out till nearly morning. To the Christmas holidays the slaves were greatly indebted for winter recreation, for long custom had given to them the whole week from Christmas Day to the coming of the New Year. On Poplar Farm the hands drew their share of clothing on Christmas Day for the year. The clothing for both men and women was made up by women kept for general sewing and housework. 1 pair of pants and 2 shirts made the entire stock for a male field hand. The women's garments were manufactured from the same goods that the men received. Many of the men worked at night for themselves, making splint and corn brooms, baskets, shuck mats, and axe handles, which they would sell in the city during Christmas week. Each slave was furnished with a pass, something like the following: "Please let my boy Jim pass anywhere in this county until January 1, 1834, and oblige, respectfully, John Gaines, M.D., Poplar Farm, St. Louis County, Missouri. With the above precious document in his pocket, a load of baskets, brooms, mats, and axe handles on his back, a bag hanging across his shoulders with a jug in each end, one for the whiskey and the other for the molasses, the slaves trudged off to town at night, singing, "Hurrah for good old massa, he give me the pass to go to the city. Hurrah for good old missus, she build a pot and give me the liquor. Hurrah, I'm going to the city. When the sun rise in the morning, just above the yellow corn, you'll find this nigger has taken warning, and's gone when the driver blows his horn. Hurrah for good old massa, he give me the pass to go to the city. Hurrah for good old missus, she build a pot and give me the liquor. Hurrah, I'm going to the city." Both the Methodists and Baptists, the religious denominations to which the blacks generally belong, never fail to be in the midst of a revival meeting during the holidays, and most of the slaves from the country hasten to these gatherings. Some, however, spend their time at the dances, raffles, cockfights, foot races, and other amusements that present themselves. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. A young and beautiful lady, closely veiled and attired in black, arrived one morning at Poplar Farm, and was shown immediately into a room in the eastern wing, where she remained, attended only by old Nancy. That the lady belonged to the better class was evident from her dress, refined manners, and the inviolable secrecy of her stay at the residence of Dr. Gaines. At last the lady gave birth to a child, which was placed under the care of Isabella, a quadroon servant, who had recently lost a baby of her own. The lady left the premises as mysteriously as she had come, and nothing more was ever seen or heard of her, certainly not by the negroes. The child, which was evidently of pure Anglo-Saxon blood, was called Lola, and grew up amongst the negro children of the place to be a bright, pretty girl, to whom her adopted mother seemed very much attached. At the time of which I write, Lola was 8 years old, and her presence on the plantation began to annoy the white members of Dr. Gaines' family, especially when strangers visited the place. The appearance of Mr. Walker, the noted slave speculator on the plantation, and whom it was said had been sent for, created no little excitement amongst the slaves, and great was the surprise to the blacks when they saw the trader taking Isabella and Lola with him at his departure. Unable to sell the little white girl at any price, Mr. Walker gave her to Mr. George Savage, who, having no children of his own, adopted the child. Isabella was sold to a gentleman who took her to Washington. The grief of the quadroon at being separated from her adopted child was intense, and greatly annoyed her new master, who determined to sell her on his arrival home. Isabella was sold to the slave trader Jennings, who placed the woman in one of the private slave pens or prisons, a number of which then disgraced the national capital. Jennings intended to send Isabella to the New Orleans market as soon as he purchased a sufficient number. At the dusk of the evening, previous to the day she was to be sent off, as the old prison was being closed for the night, Isabella suddenly darted past the keeper and ran for her life. It was not a great distance from the prison to the long bridge which passes from the lower part of the city across the Potomac to the extensive forests and woodlands of the celebrated Arlington Heights, then occupied by that distinguished relative and descendant of the immortal Washington, Mr. George W. Custis. Thither the poor fugitive directed her flight. So unexpected was her escape, that she had gained several rods the start before the keeper had secured the other prisoners and rallied his assistants to aid in the pursuit. It was at an hour, and in a part of the city where horses could not easily be obtained for the chase. No bloodhounds were at hand to run down the flying woman, and for once it seemed as if there was to be a fair trial of speed and endurance between the slave and the slave catchers. The keeper and his force raised the hue and cry on her path as they followed close behind. But so rapid was the flight along the wide avenue that the astonished citizens, as they poured forth from their dwellings to learn the cause of alarm, were only able to comprehend the nature of the case in time to fall in with the motley throng in pursuit, or raise an anxious prayer to heaven as they refused to join in the chase, as many a one did that night, that the panting fugitive might escape, and the merciless soul-dealer for once be disappointed of his prey. And now, with the speed of an arrow, having passed the avenue, with the distance between her and her pursuers constantly increasing, this poor hunted female gained the Long Bridge, as it is called, where interruption seemed improbable. Already her heart began to beat high with the hope of success. She had only to pass 3/4 of a mile across the bridge when she could bury herself in a vast forest, just at the time when the curtain of night would close around her and protect her from the pursuit of her enemies. But God, by his providence, had otherwise determined. He had ordained that an appalling tragedy should be enacted that night within plain sight of the President's house and the Capitol of the Union, which would be an evidence, wherever it should be known, of the unconquerable love of liberty which the human heart may inherit, as well as a fresh admonition to the slave dealer of the cruelty and enormity of his crimes. Just as the pursuers passed the high draw, soon after entering upon the bridge, they beheld 3 men slowly approaching from the Virginia side. They immediately called to them to arrest the fugitive, proclaiming her a runaway slave. True to their Virginia instincts, as she came near, they formed a line across the narrow bridge to intercept her. Seeing that escape was impossible in that quarter, she stopped suddenly and turned upon her pursuers. On came the profane and ribald gang faster than ever, already exulting in her capture and threatening punishment for her flight. For a moment she looked wildly and anxiously around to see if there was no hope of escape. On either hand, far down below rolled the deep, foaming waters of the Potomac, and before and behind were the rapidly approaching steps and noisy voices of her pursuers. Seeing how vain would be any further effort to escape, her resolution was instantly taken. She clasped her hands convulsively together, raised her tearful and imploring eyes towards heaven, and begged for the mercy and compassion there, which was unjustly denied her on earth. Then, with a single bound, vaulted over the railing of the bridge, and sank forever beneath the angry and foaming waters of the river. In the meantime, Mr. and Mrs. Savage were becoming more and more interested in the child, Lola, whom they had adopted, and who was fast developing into an intellectual and beautiful girl, whose bright, sparkling hazel eyes, snow-white teeth, and alabaster complexion caused her to be admired by all. In time, Lola became highly educated and was duly introduced into the best society. The cholera of 1832, in its ravages, swept off many of St. Louis's most valued citizens, and among them Mr. George Savage. Mrs. Savage, who was then in ill health, regarded Lola with even greater solicitude than during the lifetime of her late husband. Lola had been amply provided for by Mr. Savage in his will. She was being courted by Mr. Martin Phelps previous to the death of her adopted father, and the failing health of Mrs. Savage hastened the nuptials. The marriage of Mr. Phelps and Miss Savage partook more of a private than of a public affair, owing to the recent death of Mr. Savage. Mr. Phelps's residence was at the outskirts of the city, in the vicinity of what was known as the Mound, and was a lovely spot. The lady had brought considerable property to her husband. One morning in the month of December, and only about 3 months after the marriage of the Phelpses, 2 men alighted from a carriage at Mr. Phelps's door, rang the bell, and were admitted by the servant. Mr. Phelps hastened from the breakfast table as the servant informed him of the presence of the strangers. On entering the sitting room, the host recognized one of the men as Officer Mull, while the other announced himself as James Walker, and said, "I have come, Mr. Phelps, on rather an unpleasant errand. You've got a slave in your house that belongs to me." "I think you are mistaken, sir," replied Mr. Phelps. "My servants are all hired from Major Ben O'Fallon." Walker put on a sinister smile, and blandly continued, "I see, sir, that you don't understand me. 10 years ago I bought a slave child from Dr. Gaines, and lent her to Mr. George Savage, and I understand she's in your employ, and I've come to get her." And here the slave speculator took from his side pocket a large sheepskin pocketbook, and drew forth the identical bill of sale of Lola, given to him by Dr. Gaines at the time of the selling of Isabella and the child. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Mr. Phelps. "That paper, if it means anything, it means my wife." "I can't help what it means," remarked Walker. "Here's the bill of sale, and here's the officer to get me my nigger." "There must be a mistake here. It is true that my wife was the adopted daughter of the late Mr. George Savage, but there is not a drop of negro blood in her veins, and I doubt, sir, if you have ever seen her." "Well, sir," said Walker, "just bring her in the room, and I guess she'll know me." Feeling confident that the bill of sale had no reference to his wife, Mr. Phelps rang the bell, and told the boy that answered it to ask his mistress to come in. A moment or two later, and the lady entered the room. "My dear," said Mr. Phelps, "are you acquainted with either of these gentlemen?" The lady looked, hesitated, and replied, "I think not." Then Walker arose, stepped towards the window, where he could be seen to better advantage, and said, "Why, Lola, have you forgotten me? It's only about 10 years since I brought you from Poplar Farm and lent you to Mr. Savage. Ha, ha, ha." This coarse laugh of the rough, uneducated negro trader had not ceased when Lola gave a heart-rending shriek, and fell fainting upon the floor. "I thought she'd know me when I jogged her memory," said Walker, as he reseated himself. Mr. Phelps sprang to his wife and lifted her from the floor and placed her upon the sofa. "Throw a little of Adam's ale in her face. That'll bring her to. I've seen 'em faint afore, but they allus come to," said the trader. "I thank you, sir, but I will attend to my own affairs," said Mr. Phelps, in a rather petulant tone. "Yes," replied Walker, "but she's mine, and I want to see that she comes to." As soon as she revived, Mr. Phelps led his wife from the room. A conference of an hour took place on the return of Mr. Phelps to the parlor, which closed with the understanding that a legal examination of the papers should settle the whole question the next day. At the appointed time on the following morning, one of the ablest lawyers in the city, Colonel Strother, pronounced the bill of sale genuine, for it had been drawn up by Justice Maguire and witnessed by George Kennelly and Wilson P. Hunt. For this claim Walker expressed a willingness to sell the woman for $2,000. The payment of the money would have been a small matter if it had not carried with it the proof that Lola was a slave, which was undeniable evidence that she had negro blood in her veins. Yet such was the result, for Dr. Gaines had been dead these 3 years, and whoever Lola's mother was, even if living, she would not come forth to vindicate the free birth of her child. Mr. Phelps was a man of fine sensibility, and was affectionately attached to his wife. However, it was a grave question to be settled in his mind, whether his honor as a Southern gentleman and his standing in society would allow him to acknowledge a woman as his wife in whose veins coursed the accursed blood of the negro slave. Long was the struggle between love and duty, but the shame of public gaze and the ostracism of society decided the matter in favor of duty, and the young and lovely wife was informed by the husband that they must separate, never to meet again. Indescribable were the feelings of Lola as she begged him upon her knees not to leave her. The room was horrible in its darkness. Her mind lost its reasoning powers for a time. At last consciousness returned, but only to awaken in her the loneliness of her condition and the unfriendliness of that law and society that dooms one to everlasting disgrace for a blood taint which the victim did not have. 10 days after the proving of the bill of sale, the innocent Lola died of a broken heart, and was interred in the Negro burial ground, with not a white face to follow the corpse to its last resting place. Such is American race prejudice. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. The invention of the Whitney cotton gin, nearly 50 years ago, created a wonderful rise in the price of slaves in the cotton states. The value of able-bodied men fit for field hands advanced from $500 to $1,200 in the short space of 5 years. In 1850, a prime field hand was worth $2,000. The price of women rose in proportion, they being valued at about $300 less each than the men. This change in the price of slaves caused a lucrative business to spring up, both in the breeding of slaves and the sending of them to the states needing their services. Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, and North Carolina became the slave-raising sections. Virginia, however, was always considered the banner state. To the traffic in human beings, more than to any other of its evils, is the institution indebted for its overthrow. From the picture on the heading of the Liberator down to the smallest tract printed against slavery, the separation of families was the chief object of those exposing the great American sin. The tearing asunder of husbands and wives, of parents and children, and the gangs of men and women chained together en route to the New Orleans market furnished newspaper correspondents with items that never wanted readers. These newspaper paragraphs were not unfrequently made stronger by the fact that many of the slaves were as white as those who offered them for sale, and the close resemblance of the victim to the trader often reminded the purchaser that the same blood coursed through the veins of both. The removal of Dr. Gaines from Poplar Farm to St. Louis gave me an opportunity of seeing the worst features of the internal slave trade. For many years Missouri drove a brisk business in the selling of her sons and daughters, the greater number of whom passed through the city of St. Louis. For a long time James Walker was the principal speculator in this species of property. The early life of this man had been spent as a drayman, first working for others, then for himself, and eventually purchasing men who worked with him. At last, disposing of his horses and drays, he took his faithful men to the Louisiana market and sold them. This was the commencement of a career of cruelty that, in all probability, had no equal in the annals of the American slave trade. A more repulsive-looking person could scarcely be found in any community of bad-looking men than Walker. Tall, lean, and lank, with high cheekbones, face much pitted with the smallpox, gray eyes with red eyebrows and sandy whiskers, he, indeed, stood alone without mate or fellow in looks. He prided himself upon what he called his goodness of heart, and was always speaking of his humanity. Walker often boasted that he never separated families if he could persuade the purchaser to take the whole lot. He would always advertise in the New Orleans papers that he would be there with a prime lot of able-bodied slaves, men and women, fit for field service, with a few extra ones calculated for house servants, all between the ages of 15 and 25 years. But, like most men who make a business of speculating in human beings, he often bought many who were far advanced in years, and would try to pass them off for 5 or 6 years younger than they were. Few persons can arrive at anything approaching the real age of the Negro by mere observation, unless they are well acquainted with the race. Therefore, the slave trader frequently carried out the deception with perfect impunity. As soon as the steamer would leave the wharf and was fairly on the bosom of the broad Mississippi, the speculator would call his servant Pompey to him, and instruct him as to getting the slaves ready for the market. If any of the blacks looked as if they were older than they were advertised to be, it was Pompey's business to fit them for the day of sale. Pomp, as he was usually called by the trader, was of real negro blood, and would often say, when alluding to himself, "Dis nigger am no counterfeit. He is the genuine article. Dis child is none of your half and half. There is no bogus about him." Pompey was of low stature, round face, and, like most of his race, had a set of teeth which, for whiteness and beauty, could not be surpassed. His eyes were large, lips thick, and hair short and woolly. Pomp had been with Walker so long, and seen so much of buying and selling of his fellow creatures, that he appeared perfectly indifferent to the heart-rending scenes which daily occurred in his presence. Such is the force of habit. Vice is a monster of such frightful mien, that to be hated needs but to be seen. But seen too oft, familiar with its face, we first endure, then pity, then embrace. Before reaching the place of destination, Pompey would pick out the older portion and say, "I is the chap dat is to get you ready for the Orleans market, so that you will bring Massa a good price. How old is you?" addressing himself to a man that showed some age. "If I live to see next corn planting time, I'll be 40." "Dat may be," replied Pompey, "but now you is only 30 years old. Dat's what Massa says you is to be." "I know I is more dan dat," responded the man. "I can't help nuffin 'bout dat," returned Pompey, "but when you git in de market, and any one asks you how old you is, and you tell him you is 40, Massa will tie you on up, and when he's done whipping you, you'll be glad to say you was only 30. "Well, den, I reckon I is only 30," said the slave. "What is your name?" asked Pompey of another man in the group. "Jeems," was the response. "Oh, Uncle Jim, is it?" "Yes." "Den you must hab all dem gray whiskers shaved off, and dem gray hairs plucked out your head. De fact is, you's got old too quick." This was all said by Pompey in a manner which showed that he knew his business. "How old is you?" asked Pompey of a tall, strong-looking man. "I am 29 next Christmas Eve," said the man. "What's your name?" "My name is Tobias," replied the slave. "Tobias!" ejaculated Pompey with a sneer that told that he was ready to show his brief authority. "Now you's putting on airs. Your name is Toby, and why can't you tell the truth? Remember now dat you is 23 years old, and afore you goes in de market your face must be greased, for I see you's one of dem kind of ashy niggers, and a little grease will make your face look black and slick and make you look younger." Pompey reported to his master the condition of affairs, when the latter said, "Be sure that the niggers don't forget what you have taught them, for our luck depends a great deal upon the appearance of our stock." With this lot of slaves was a beautiful quadroon, a girl of 20 years, fair as most white women, with hair a little wavy, large black eyes, and a countenance that betokened intelligence beyond the common house servant. Her name was Marion, and the jealousy of the mistress, so common in those days, was the cause of her being sold. Not far from Canal Street in the city of New Orleans, in the old days of slavery, stood a 2-story flat building surrounded by a stone wall some 12 feet high, the top of which was covered with bits of glass, and so constructed as to prevent even the possibility of any one's passing over it without sustaining great injury. Many of the rooms in this building resembled the cells of a prison, and in a small apartment near the office were to be seen any number of iron collars, hobbles, handcuffs, thumb screws, cowhides, chains, gags, and yokes. A back yard, enclosed by a high wall, looked like the playground attached to one of our large New England schools, in which were rows of benches and swings. Attached to the back premises was a good-sized kitchen, where, at the time of which we write, 2 old negresses were at work, stewing, boiling, and baking, and occasionally wiping the perspiration from their furrowed and swarthy brows. The slave trader, Walker, on his arrival at New Orleans, took up his quarters here, with his gang of human cattle, and the morning after, at 10 o'clock, they were exhibited for sale. First of all came the beautiful Marion, whose pale countenance and dejected look told how many sad hours she had passed since parting with her mother. There, too, was a poor woman who had been separated from her husband, and another woman whose looks and manners were expressive of deep anguish sat by her side. There was Uncle James, with his whiskers off, his face shaven clean, and the gray hairs plucked out, ready to be sold for 10 years younger than he was. Toby was also there, with his face shaven and greased, ready for inspection. The examination commenced and was carried on in such a manner as to shock the feelings of anyone not entirely devoid of the milk of human kindness. "What are you wiping your eyes for?" inquired a fat, red-faced man with a white hat set on one side of his head and a cigar in his mouth, of a woman who sat on one of the benches. "Because I left my man behind." "Oh. If I buy you, I will furnish you with a better man than you left. I've got lots of young bucks on my farm," responded the man. "I don't want and never will have another man," replied the woman. "What's your name?" asked a man in a straw hat of a tall negro, who stood with his arms folded across his breast, leaning against the wall. "My name is Aaron, sir." "How old are you?" 25. "Where were you raised?" "In old Virginia, sir." "How many men have owned you?" 4. "Do you enjoy good health?" "Yes, sir." "How long did you live with your first owner?" 20 years. "Did you ever run away?" "No, sir." "Did you ever strike your master?" "No, sir." "Were you ever whipped much?" "No, sir. I suppose I didn't deserve it, sir." "How long did you live with your second master?" 10 years, sir." "Have you a good appetite?" "Yes, sir." "Can you eat your allowance?" "Yes, sir, when I can get it." "Where were you employed in Virginia?" "I worked in the tobacco field." "In the tobacco field, eh?" "Yes, sir." "How old did you say you was?" 25, sir, next sweet tater digging time." "I am a cotton planter, and if I buy you, you will have to work in the cotton field. My men pick 150 pounds a day, and the women 140 pounds, and those who fail to perform their task receive 5 stripes for each pound that is wanting. Now do you think you could keep up with the rest of the hands?" "I don't know, sir, but I reckon I'd have to." "How long did you live with your third master?" 3 years, sir," replied the slave. "Why, that makes you 33. I thought you told me you were only 25." Aaron now looked first at the planter, then at the trader, and seemed perfectly bewildered. He had forgotten the lesson given him by Pompey relative to his age, and the planter's circuitous questions, doubtless to find out the slave's real age, had thrown the negro off his guard. "I must see your back so as to know how much you have been whipped before I think of buying." Pompey, who had been standing by during the examination, thought that his services were now required, and stepping forth with a degree of officiousness, said to Aaron, Don't you hear the gemman tell you he wants to examine you? Come, unharness yourself, old boy, and don't be standing there." Aaron was examined and pronounced sound, yet the conflicting statement about his age was not satisfactory. On the following trip down the river, Walker halted at Vicksburg with a prime lot of slaves, and a circumstance occurred which shows what the slaves in those days would resort to save themselves from flogging, while at the same time it exhibits the quick wit of the race. While entertaining some of his purchasers at the hotel, Walker ordered Pompey to hand the wine around to his guests. In doing this, the servant upset a glass of wine upon a gentleman's lap. For this mishap, the trader determined to have his servant punished. He therefore gave Pompey a sealed note, and ordered him to take it to the slave prison. The servant, suspecting that all was not right, hastened to open the note before the wafer had dried. And passing the steamboat landing, he got a sailor to read the note, which proved to be as Pompey had suspected, in order to have him receive 39 stripes upon the bare back. Walker had given the man a silver dollar, with orders to deliver it, with the note, to the jailer, for it was common in those days for persons who wanted their servants punished and did not wish to do it themselves, to send them to the slave pen and have it done, the price for which was $1. How to escape the flogging, and yet bring back to his master the evidence of having been punished, perplexed the fertile brain of Pompey. However, the servant was equal to the occasion. Standing in front of the slave pen, the negro saw another well-dressed colored man coming up the street, and he determined to inquire in regard to how they did the whipping there. "How de do, sir?" said Pompey, addressing the colored brother. "Do you live here?" "Oh, no," replied the stranger. "I am a free man, and belong in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania." "Aha! Den you don't live here," said Pompey. "No, I left my boat here last week, and I have been trying every day to get something to do. I'm pretty well out of money, and I'd do almost anything just now." A thought flashed upon Pompey's mind. This was his occasion. "Well," said the slave, "if you want a job where you can make some money quick, I specs I can help you." "If you will," replied the freeman, "you'll do me a great favor." "Here then," said Pompey, "take dis note and go into dat prison dar, and they will give you a trunk. Bring it out, and I'll tell you where to carry it to. And here's $1. Dat will pay you, won't it?" "Yes," replied the man, with many thanks. And taking the note and the shining coin, with smiles he went to the bell gate, and gave the bell a loud ring. The gate flew open, and in he went. The man had scarcely disappeared ere Pompey had crossed the street, and was standing at the gate, listening to the conversation then going on between the jailer and the free colored man. "Where is the $1 that you got with this note?" asked the whipper, as he finished reading the epistle. "Here it is, sir." "He gave it to me," said the man, with no little surprise. "Hand it here," responded the jailer in a rough voice. "There now. Take this nigger, Pete, and strap him down upon the stretcher, and get him ready for business." "What are you going to do to me?" cried the horrified man, at the jailer's announcement. "You'll know damn quick," was the response. The resistance of the innocent man caused the whipper to call in 3 other sturdy blacks, and in a few minutes the victim was fastened upon the stretcher, face downwards, his clothing removed, and the strong-armed white negro whipper standing over him with uplifted whip. The cries and groans of the poor man, as the heavy instrument of torture fell upon his bare back, aroused Pompey, who retreated across the street, stood awaiting the result, and wondering if he could obtain from the injured man the receipt which the jailer always gives the slave to take back to his master as evidence of his having been punished. As the gate opened, and the colored brother made his appearance, looking wildly about for Pompey, the latter called out, "Here I is, sir." Maddened by the pain from the excoriation of his bleeding back, and the surprise and astonishment at the quickness with which the whole thing had been accomplished, the man ran across the street, upbraiding in the most furious manner his deceiver, who also appeared amazed at the epithets bestowed upon him. "What have I done to you?" asked Pompey, with a seriousness that was indeed amusing. "What ain't you done?" said the man, the tears streaming down his face. "You've got my back cut all to pieces," continued the victim. "What did you let him whip you for?" said Pompey with a concealed smile. "You knew that note was to get somebody whipped, and you put it on me. And here is a piece of paper that he gave me and told me to give it to my master, just as if I had a master." "Well," responded Pompey, "I have a $50, and I'll give that to you, if you'll give me the paper." Seeing that he could make no better bargain, the man gave up the receipt, taking in exchange the silver coin. "Now," said Pompey, "I'm mighty sorry for you, and if you'll go down to the house, I'll pray for you. I'm powerful in prayer, that I is." However, the freeman declined Pompey's offer. "I reckon you'll behave yourself and not spill the wine over gentlemen again," said Walker, as Pompey handed him the note from the jailer. "The next time you commit such a blunder, you'll not get off so easy," continued the speculator. Pompey often spoke of the appearance of "my friend," as he called the colored brother, and would enjoy a hearty laugh, saying, "He was a freeman, and could afford to go to bed, and lay there till he got well." Strangers to the institution of slavery and its effects upon its victims would frequently speak with astonishment of the pride that slaves would show in regard to their own value in the market. This was especially so at auction sales where town or city servants were sold. "What did your master pay for you?" would often be asked by one slave of another. $800. $800, ha ha! Well, if I didn't sell for more than $800, I'd never show my head again among respectable people. You got so much to say about me selling cheap. Now I want to know how much your boss paid for you. My boss paid $1,500 cash for me, and it was a rainy day, and not many out to the auction, or he'd had to pay a heap more, let me tell you. I'm none of your cheap niggers, I ain't. Hi, uncle. Did they sell you yesterday? I see you down there at the market. Yes, they sold me. How much did you fetch? $1,800. That was pretty smart for a man like you, ain't it? Well, I don't know. It's no more than I was worth. For you must remember I was raised by the Christies. I'm none of your common niggers selling for a picayune. I think my new boss got me mighty cheap. And so you sold last Saturday for $900, so I heard. Well, what on it? All I got to say is, if I was sold tomorrow and didn't bring more than $900, I'd never look a decent man in the face again. These and other sayings of the kind were often heard in any company of colored men in our Southern towns. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. Throughout the Southern States there are still to be found remnants of the old-time Africans who were stolen from their native land and sold in the Savannah, Mobile, and New Orleans markets, in defiance of all law. The last named city, however, and its vicinity, had a larger portion of these people than any other section. New Orleans was their center, and where their meetings were not uninteresting. Congo Square takes its name, as is well known, from the Congo Negroes who used to perform their dance on its sward every Sunday. They were a curious people, and brought over with them this remnant of their African jungles. In Louisiana there were 6 different tribes of Negroes, named after the section of the country from which they came, and their representatives could be seen on the square, their teeth filed and their cheeks still bearing tattoo marks. The majority of our city Negroes came from the Creoles, a numerous tribe who dwell in stockades. We had here the Minas, a proud, dignified, warlike race; the Congos, a treacherous, shrewd, relentless people; the Mandringas, a branch of the Congos; the Gangas, named after the river of that name, from which they had been taken; the Hiboas, called by the missionaries the Owls, a sullen, intractable tribe; and the Foulas, the highest type of the African, with but few representatives here. These were the people that one would meet on the square many years ago. It was a gala occasion, these Sundays in those years, and not less than 2,000 or 3,000 people would congregate there to see the dusky dancers. A low fence enclosed the square, and on each street there was a little gate and turnstile. There were no trees then, and the ground was worn bare by the feet of the people. About 3 o'clock the negroes began to gather, each nation taking their places in different parts of the square. The Minas would not dance near the Congos, nor the Mandringas near the Gangas. Presently the music would strike up, and the parties would prepare for the sport. Each set had its own orchestra. The instruments were a peculiar kind of banjo, made of a Louisiana gourd, several drums made of a gum stump dug out, with a sheepskin head, and beaten with the fingers, and 2 jaw bones of a horse, which when shaken would rattle the loose teeth, keeping time with the drums. About 8 negroes, 4 male and 4 female, would make a set, and generally they were but scantily clad. It took some little time before the tapping of the drums would arouse the dull and sluggish dancers, but when the point of excitement came, nothing can faithfully portray the wild and frenzied motions they go through. Backward and forward, this way and that, now together and now apart, every motion intended to convey the most sensual ideas. As the dance progressed, the drums were thrummed faster, the contortions became more grotesque, until sometimes, in frenzy, the women and men would fall fainting to the ground. All this was going on with a dense crowd looking on, and with a hot sun pouring its torrid rays on the infatuated actors of this curious ballet. After one set had become fatigued, they would drop out to be replaced by others, and then stroll off to the groups of some other tribe in a different portion of the square. Then it was that trouble would commence, and a regular set to with short sticks followed, between the men, and broken heads ended the day's entertainment. On the sidewalks around the square, the old negresses, with their spruce beer and peanuts, cocoanuts and popcorn, did a thriving trade, and now and then beneath petticoats, bottles of tafia, a kind of Louisiana rum, peeped out, of which the gendarmes were oblivious. When the sun went down, a stream of people poured out of the turnstiles, and the gendarmes, walking through the square, would order the dispersion of the negroes, and by gunfire at 9 o'clock the place was well nigh deserted. These dances were kept up until within the memory of men still living, and many who believe in them, and who would gladly revive them, may be found in every state in the Union. The early traditions, brought down through the imported Africans, have done much to keep alive the belief that the devil is a personal being, with hoofs, horns, and having powers equal with God. These ideas give influence to the conjurer, goofer, doctor, and fortune teller. While visiting one of the upper parishes not long since, I was stopping with a gentleman who was accustomed to make weekly visits to a neighbouring cemetery, sitting for hours amongst the graves, at which occurrence the wife felt very sad. I inquired of her the object of her husband's strange freak. "Oh," said she, "he's influenced out there by angels." "Has he gone to the cemetery now?" I asked. "Yes," was the reply. "I think I can cure him of it, if you will promise to keep the whole thing a secret." "I will," was the reply. "Let me have a sheet and unloose your dog, and I will put the cure in motion. I said. Rolla, the big Newfoundland dog, was unfastened. The sheet was well fitted around his neck, tightly sewed, and the pet told to go hunt his master. Taking the trail, the dog at once made for the cemetery. Screams of "Help! Help! God save me!" coming from the direction of the tombs, aroused the neighborhood. The cries of the man frightened the dog, and he returned home in haste. The sheet, half torn, was removed, and Rolla again fastened in his house. Very soon Mr. Martin was led in by two friends, who picked him up from the sidewalk with his face considerably bruised. His story was that the devil had chased him out of the cemetery, tripped him up on the sidewalk, and hence the flow of blood from the wound on his face. The above is a fair index to most of the ghost stories. End of Chapter 12.